Before the world knew his name, heaven was already moving. For generations, the promise hummed in the silence of the night, a weight carried by the faithful through centuries of dust and shadow. In the hills of Nazareth, the air held that same heavy stillness. Mary knelt by her loom, the rhythmic clack of wood against wood marking the passage of time. Then, the atmosphere shifted. The air shimmered, vibrating with a sudden, intense stillness that silenced the very wind outside. A light bloomed in the center of the room, not a fire that consumed, but a clarity that stripped away the dark. An angel stood before her. Mary gripped the edge of her loom, her knuckles white, her breath hitching in her throat as the room seemed to expand into something vast. The angel spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a bell. He spoke of a son, of a lineage that would bridge the gap between heaven and earth. Mary did not ask for a sign. She did not reach for proof. She bowed her head, her fingers loosening their grip on the wood, and whispered, "Let it be." In that moment, the quiet room became the center of a promise. The light lingered, casting long, steady shadows as the weight of centuries finally found its anchor. Across town, the air in the workshop was thick with the smell of cedar shavings and unresolved pain. Joseph stood motionless, his chisel pressed against the wood, the metal biting deep into the grain but refusing to move. He had spent the last 3 nights pacing the dirt floor, the rhythm of his own footsteps echoing the sting of betrayal he could not shake. He looked at the half-finished work and saw only the wreckage of his expectations. Then, the dream arrived. It was not a whisper, but a command that sliced through his doubt with the precision of a blade. He woke in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs, the silence of the room suddenly feeling heavy with a new, terrifying clarity. He did not wait for the sun. He stepped out into the cool night air, his stride purposeful, moving through the narrow streets until he reached Mary's door. He did not knock. He entered, and when their eyes met, the questions he had carried dissolved. He reached out and took her hand, his palm rough against hers. No words were exchanged, but the pressure of his grip was a vow. The decree from Caesar arrived like a sudden, biting wind, shattering the quiet of their preparation. It demanded a census, a tally of heads that forced them away from the safety of Nazareth and onto the long, winding road to Bethlehem. The path was not a road, but a jagged scar carved into the landscape, littered with loose shale and stones that bit through the soles of their feet. Mary moved slowly, her hand pressed against her side, her pace dictated by the heavy burden she carried. The sun beat down, turning the dust into a fine, choking haze that clung to their skin. Joseph walked slightly ahead, his eyes scanning the horizon. When they reached a steep, uneven incline, Mary stumbled, her breath catching as she gripped Joseph's arm for support. He pulled her close, his own fatigue forgotten, and they stood for a moment in the silence of the wilderness. 2 small figures against the vast, indifferent earth. The landscape grew harsher with every mile, the shadows stretching long and thin as the day began to fade into a cold, uncertain twilight. The sun bled into the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the narrow streets of Bethlehem. The town was a chaotic hive, overflowing with travelers who had arrived for the census, their voices a dull roar. Joseph moved through the press of bodies, his hand firmly on Mary's arm, guiding her toward the first sign of a hearth. He knocked. The wood was heavy, unyielding. A face appeared, eyes scanning them with quick, dismissive judgment before the door slammed shut. He tried again at the next house, and the next. Each time, the result was the same. A hand shoved the door closed. Joseph's knuckles were raw, his voice hoarse as he pleaded. At the largest inn, the keeper pointed toward the dark outskirts. With nowhere left to turn, they retreated to the edge of the village, finding a limestone cave carved into the hillside. Joseph cleared a corner, his hands trembling as he laid out his cloak, the weight of their isolation pressing down. The cave was a hollowed-out scar in the limestone, cold and smelling of damp earth and animal musk. Joseph moved to the back, his hands shaking as he cleared a patch of dirt and spread his cloak over the uneven ground. Mary sat, her face pale in the dim light, her focus narrowing to the rhythm of her own breathing. Outside, the village continued its indifferent bustle. But here, the world narrowed to this single, shadowed space. Then, the stillness broke. A sharp intake of breath cut through the dark. Mary gripped the rough stone wall, her knuckles white. As the first wave of labor took hold, Joseph knelt beside her, his hands hovering, useless against the tide of the moment. Then, a cry pierced the darkness, high, thin, and impossibly clear. Joseph moved with sudden, frantic tenderness, catching the infant as he came into the world. Mary wrapped him in strips of cloth, her movements steady despite her exhaustion. She reached out, placing him into the wooden manger. Miles from the village, the shepherds huddled around a dying fire, the embers casting flickering, weak light against the encroaching dark. Their eyes scanned the perimeter, alert for the low growl of wolves or the shifting of shadows. The night was absolute, heavy with the scent of dry grass and cold stone. Then, the sky tore open. It did not fade into light, it shattered. A brilliance, sharper and more intense than the midday sun, slammed into the hillsides, bleaching the world of color and shadow. The shepherds scrambled back, shielding their eyes, their boots sliding on the loose shale as they fell to their knees. The silence of the night vanished, replaced by a sound that vibrated through their very marrow, a chorus of voices, layered and vast, singing of peace that defied the heavy earth. The air itself seemed to hum with the force of the sound. The men did not speak. They could not. They stared upward, faces illuminated by the searing golden glow that poured from the heavens. The shepherds did not wait for a second sign. They scrambled upright, abandoning their fire and their flocks, and began to run. Their feet pounded against the hard-packed earth, kicking up clouds of dust. The village was silent, but the shepherds did not slow until they reached the limestone ridge. They skidded to a halt, chests heaving, their lungs burning from the long, desperate sprint. The cave entrance stood before them, a jagged, dark mouth in the hillside. They froze. The celestial fire that had filled the sky was gone, leaving only the mundane smell of damp straw and livestock. They looked at each other, dust-caked and trembling, wondering if the vision had been a trick of the night. Then, a faint sound drifted the soft breathing of an infant. They stepped forward, their heavy boots crunching on the loose gravel. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the stars filtering through the opening. They moved deeper, their rough, calloused hands brushing against the cool, damp stone walls. In the center, a wooden manger sat amidst the hay. They stopped, the air in their throats catching. There, wrapped in simple strips of cloth, lay the child. The shepherds knelt, the dirt of the fields staining their knees. One man reached out, his fingers shaking, and brushed the edge of the linen. The world outside remained dark, but here, the promise had taken breath. Far to the east, the journey had been a relentless test of endurance. 3 travelers had crossed shifting, wind-whipped dunes and climbed jagged mountain passes where the air grew thin and biting. Their eyes remained locked on a single, piercing star that defied the constellations, pulling them westward across the map of the world. They arrived at the stable's edge, the heavy scent of gold and rare spices clinging to their saddlebags. They stepped inside, expecting the trappings of a palace or the cold authority of a throne. Instead, they found only the dim, earthy interior of a cave. They halted, the weight of their long travel falling away. As they looked at the child, there was no crown, no guard, no royal herald. Yet, as they stood in the quiet, the truth took hold. The travelers moved forward, their movements deliberate and slow. They knelt in the dirt, the dust of the floor mingling with the fine fabrics they carried. One by one, they opened their hands. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh spilled forward, falling from their palms onto the hay. They bowed their heads. The visitors eventually turned and walked back into the night, their footsteps fading until the only sound remaining was the soft, rhythmic intake of breath from the manger. Mary sat back against the cool limestone wall, her gaze drifting toward the cave entrance where the stars still burned with an unnatural, piercing intensity. The air in the stable grew still, the frantic energy of the journey and the weight of the tributes replaced by a profound, heavy silence. She reached out, her fingers tracing the rough edge of the wood, feeling the warmth radiating from the infant. Outside, the world continued its restless turning, the distant sounds of the village barely reaching this hidden place. But here, the centuries of waiting had finally collapsed into this single, fragile point of light. The prophecy had unspooled, thread by thread, until it reached its quiet conclusion. There was no longer a need for signs or voices. The promise was no longer a distant echo or a scroll hidden in the dust. It was here, pulsing with life in the dark. Mary watched the child sleep, the shadows lengthening across the hay. The cold night air pressed against the cave, yet the space felt filled with a warmth that defied the season. The waiting had ended. The long, jagged path of history had found its destination in the humble, earthy silence of the stable. In the stillness, hope breathed for the first time, and the world, for one brief, eternal moment, held its breath in perfect, lasting peace.